you so much. And I want to introduce our guest for the morning, Andrew Yang. Jan Vilsek's story is a remarkable story of immigration, and he and his family foundation just bestowed upon you the Vilsek Prize. So I'd like to hear your story about your parents, about your childhood, about growing up, and about your immigration story.
Thank you, Stephen. My parents immigrated here from Taiwan as students, and they met as students at UC Berkeley. So my brother was named after the Lawrence Observatory. I was born in Schenectady, New York. My father worked as an engineer at GE there, and then he moved to IBM. And I remember vividly growing up, one of the only Asian kids in my town. Town was predominantly white. And also having skipped a grade, I was always smaller and scrawnier than the kids around me. So I felt this acute sense of trying to belong or fit in. And a lot of that was feeling like my family and I had come to the country relatively recently, where my parents did not know anything about about pop culture or whatever my brother and I were experiencing. So that was formative. And certainly for me, my adolescence was shaped by this struggle to try to carve out a place for myself in my town at first, and then feeling like I always had to prove myself in some way. So I'm really grateful to the Vilsek Foundation and the family for everything they do to elevate immigrant stories around the country. I'm very passionate about the fact that immigrants make this country stronger and more dynamic in many, many dimensions.
Well, just so you know that I know where you grew up, I'm going to throw a word out there that no one will know except you and I. Niskayuna.
Yeah, Niskayuna.
It was the big GE operation.
Yeah, and I have a real soft spot for upstate New York in that, it prospered for a long time, but then now it's hit harder times as GE's presence there has been reduced. And I'd say that's actually something that many, many communities around the country have experienced, certainly in upstate New York, where you look at giants like Kodak and Bausch and Lomb that used to define their cities. So GE had that relationship with Schenectady and Niskayuna.
So when people get into politics, often you can track them back and see the early kind of DNA of student leaders. When you were in high school, did you run for student government? Were you one of those kids that was in the front of the class kind of, or were you more of a shy back of the room kind of guy?
One, I never ran, and two, if I had run, I would have performed miserably. So I was definitely not like that kid who everyone's like, oh, he's going to run for president someday. It was much more the quiet, brooding, somewhat angry loner listening to the Smiths and like having like an overcoat and a skater haircut and that sort of thing, which I was self-conscious about when I ran, because New York Magazine published high school yearbook photos, and I was like, I wonder how people are going to respond to this. This doesn't seem very customarily presidential, but then some people got very excited about it because I seemed like a real teenager. But I certainly never planned on running for office, and anyone around me during my formative years also, I think, would be shocked to see what has transpired since then.
So talk about your first company. I mean, I read a little bit and I tried to kind of, school myself, and there's not a lot of conversation about what you actually did that made it for you as that first tech company. What was it? Was it
my first tech company? Well, is an internet company that raised money for celebrity affiliated nonprofits through a click to donate model. And the reason why you don't hear much about it, Stephen, is because the business flopped. So that there isn't a whole lot to go through where there weren't massive achievements. We had what I call rise and maximum fall, where you could fall to zero from a not so great height. And that was a formative experience for me too, because running a company that flops, everyone knows that your attempt failed, and my parents used to tell their friends I was still a lawyer because that was a little bit easier for them. They're Asian, you know. So so there was like a really difficult period during my 20s when I was a failed entrepreneur and a frustrated entrepreneur. But I kept trying, and eventually found my footing, but it was years and years before I really hit my stride. And so I appreciate entrepreneurs of every stripe, where if you're starting anything from a significant tech company to like a corner diner or food truck, it's really, really difficult. And there's a lot more failure than success in a lot of these stories.
So when you look in the mirror, like, do you think of yourself as a New Yorker? Is that your internal label for yourself?
Well, I've spent the last 10 years or so all over the place. But I'm clearly a New Yorker, from the fact that I was born in upstate New York to the fact that I've spent the vast majority of my 45 years living in New York City or upstate. So yeah, I'm very much a New Yorker. I was a dyed in the wool Knicks fan until relatively recently. Like I grew up watching the Mets. It's like the rest of it. So I'm very much a New Yorker. I love New York. I owe New York a great deal. And it's heartbreaking to see how much we're struggling now because of this pandemic. In some ways, unfortunately, a lot of the things that brought us to New York City in particular, like now they're shut. I was just talking to someone who works in musical theater, and like Broadway has been shut for months and has no designs on coming back. And a lot of people think about that as a defining element of New York. I talked to Jose Andres, who's a restaurateur, and talked about how the majority of restaurants are going to need some kind of relief in order to avoid closing in the next number of days and weeks. So a lot of the quintessentially New York institutions are in peril right now because of the pandemic and the associated closings.
So, New York's last 10 years, there's been this pretty remarkable, invention of the connection between universities, large tech, media, both as a funder and a buyer of startups. And students come here. Now there's more tech jobs for them, or at least there has been. When you look ahead, now that we know that we're in this COVID era, like a lot of the things that you talked about, which, not that long ago seemed pretty far out in terms of technology and AI and driverless vehicles and kind of the coming challenges to employment have happened very, very quickly. Do you think that New York's facing a bump in the road, or is this a fundamental change that we're facing?
Well, Stephen, the change is going to look very, very different depending upon who you are and what part of the economy you're interacting with, frankly. Where if you work in the digital economy, you might be busier than ever. I have relative who works at Google, and they're just all working from home, and they're not going to the New York office, but they're as busy as ever. Actually, his business is up. And then if you're a security guard or food truck operator or personal trainer or hairstylist or something along those lines, then things have become very, very difficult very, very quickly. And that's going to be the case for months because a lot of the activities that we enjoyed for so long are going to be curtailed for months. So it depends upon where you're approaching New York from, Stephen. But this transformation is profound. And I feel for so many of the people that are seeing their wages, their opportunities, their work hours cut because they're going home and through no fault of their own, and they're trying to figure out what the next steps look like and hoping that we revert back to some version of pre-COVID normalcy, but that's going to be elusive for quite some time.
So here's the challenge in talking about tech, particularly with you, is like there's a very exciting innovation story to tell, and then there's a really scary tech eats our jobs and our livelihood story. So I'm going to do them in order, and I'm going to do the fun one first, and then we'll do the hard one. So the Media Lab, you may know, the NYC Media Lab is a consortium of universities and tech companies and media companies, and we sit at the middle of all of this cool stuff. And so I was thinking about, like, when you we'll do the cool part first. So when you look out at, electric vehicles, embedded human to machine sensors, underground highways, space flight to Mars. Oh wait, I think I just did all Elon Musk startups. I didn't really mean to do only Musk things, but like, is there a piece of technology or a project or something that you look at and you geek out on it, like it's exciting for you?
I love technology. I love progress, but we have to be clear-eyed about the impact it's going to have on many, many Americans' livelihoods in particular. And I like to point to things that are happening right now, Stephen. Google just a number of days ago announced that they have AI that can do your call center work for you if you're a business. And if you're any kind of leadership team, you look up and say, wow, like Google's AI can like handle our incoming customer service calls. That's tremendous. But if you're one of the 2 million plus Americans who work at a call center right now making $12, $13 an hour, you're like, wait a minute, like Google could do my job. Like, maybe they went from going to a physical call center to doing it from home, and now they have to compete against Google. So these things can be simultaneously exciting and terrifying, again, depending upon your vantage point. Because if I'm the business runner or the shareholder of that business, I am thrilled that you might be able to automate some of these customer service inquiries. But if I'm someone who does that for a living, then it's terrifying. So both of the stories can be simultaneously true and very, very powerful and compelling. The entity that's supposed to help bridge this gulf between those two vantage points is government. But we have lost faith in our government's ability to actually help us meaningfully adjust. And that's one reason I ran for president.
Are there industries that are core to New York today that you think, listen, we're not going to rescue we have to set it out on an iceberg and set it off to sea because they're just not coming back? And then conversely, are there industries that could evolve and the technology can make them bigger, stronger, more relevant to employment in New York in the next 5 years?
For the first category, my argument would be that you want to put them in suspended animation. You want to say, look, maybe people aren't going to Broadway shows right now, but it's possible to come 2022 that Broadway is back bigger than ever. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to have organizations and industries disappear that could become a huge part of an eventual recovery. So that's category one, is suspended animation. And those things would be live entertainment, restaurants, a lot of culture and tourism. These are core industries to New York, both economically and socially, and we can't let them go. Fashion, you could put in this category as well. Like, there are a lot of things that define New York that maybe right now don't look the same, that we need to try and put in a cryonic chamber and say, we're going to bring you back. And so we don't want anything to disappear or wither away. And then there are the industries where technology is going to play an enormous role in defining the future. And that would be finance, certainly media, certainly tech. I mean, that would be self-evident. And in those industries, you want to invest, but you also want to make it so that the value proposition that is unique to New York remains very, very clear. Because some of these industries and firms, and I talk to them, certainly if you're like a small finance outfit, you might think to yourself, hey, you know what? Florida has a really low tax rate. Like, maybe we can just sort of relocate our shop there. And at this point, because of the connectivity, we can operate effectively. One of the major changes, Stephen, is that small financial outfit has been based in New York up to this time, because a lot of their customers are based in New York. If someone wants to visit New York, they have a slick New York office, because people like to feel like their money is being handled by people who, are close to the center of it all and plugged in and, are effective on a corporate level. But now if no one's visiting you, then they're looking up being like, wait, why are we paying for this commercial real estate rent? There's a lot of re-examination of physical footprints and layouts that's going on from firms that are big and small. And the burden in some ways is on New York to say, look, there are very, very important reasons to be here, regardless of whether or not people are traveling to the same degree or going to the office to the same degree.
So one of your kind of tentpole ideas that you talk about a lot and that's core to the book is UBI, Universal Basic Income. I can't help but think that COVID and the federal government writing checks to all of these unemployed Americans was in some ways a little bit of a dry run. Like, how will people treat being given money, and not huge amounts of money, by the way? How did that? I assume there's no one that had more interest in how that was going to turn out than you did. So talk a little bit about a UBI and how your feelings may or may not have changed as a result of that experiment.
Any economist who's looking at what's gone on over the last number of months is blown away by the positive impact of putting cash into people's hands. I saw one study, Stephen, that made me laugh. It said cash stimulus reduced the poverty rate in the U.S. And then you look up and say, well, I guess that makes a lot of sense. If you ramped up benefits and put money into people's hands, you reduce poverty. But like they reacted like it was this giant news flash. Any economist who's looked at it, though, has said that direct cash relief has been one of the most effective things we've done, that we should do more of it. And you know who agrees with that? 75% plus of Americans. Right now, 75% of Americans think we should have cash relief during the pandemic, and 55% think we should have universal basic income in perpetuity. And I have to say that those numbers are just going to trend up, not down. So when you talk about the cash relief as a dry run for universal basic income, millions of Americans got that $1,200 stimulus check and loved it. And they looked up and said, wait, we can do this? We can actually put money into our hands as opposed to just bailing out like a megacorp or a mega bank or whatnot. And I believe that direct experience people have had is one of the things that's driven this 75% plus approval rating for cash relief, because everyone now knows that it's possible and it works. So this is not going anywhere. This is just going to grow and grow. Kamala and Joe just came out with a very, very ambitious child credit that resembles a universal basic income. It's essentially like if you're a parent of a child below a certain age, you're going to get $100 a month, like hundreds of dollars a month directly. So we're just going to keep heading in this direction. Kamala also endorsed a $2,000 a month pandemic cash relief plan that would be, frankly, like very, very similar to universal basic income for the duration of the pandemic. So I never would have wished this crisis, this devastating time on anyone. But my great hope is that we can accelerate some of the solutions as well as the problems.
So you may have seen already yesterday, our keynote was given by Tristan Harris. Tristan has a film that's now playing on Netflix that's interestingly, wildly popular. The social, I always want to say conundrum, but it's not. It's not. It's about Facebook and it's about social media. The dilemma, right? It just doesn't roll off my tongue. I don't know why. Tell me about, like, does his thesis align with what your concerns are? I mean, he's essentially saying social media, left unchecked, has the potential to be, cancerous. And the film's disturbing. Yeah. The film is eye-opening. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so grateful to Tristan. Tristan's a friend of mine. I am 100% aligned with his perspective. And it's not even just potentially cancerous or corrosive. It's already tearing us apart. You can just look up right now and say, why is it that so many Americans disagree so much on the coronavirus and Trump and other things? It's because many of us are just seeing different versions of reality right now. You get information from your Facebook feed, and you're on the right, you're getting a completely different version of reality than folks on the left. And then you ask yourself, well, how do you bring a country together around real solutions? For example, where now one seems pretty freaking obvious. If you get even bigger than that and more ambitious than that, social media is one of the major factors that is keeping us from being able to agree on things enough to actually have any kind of consensus build around solutions. And people who are watching this, if you're young, you know this because you're experiencing it directly. We've seen a massive spike in anxiety and depression among teenagers, teenage girls in particular. That's hand in hand with smartphones and social media adoption. And you have to ask yourself, if you're a multi-billion-dollar tech company who's driving advertising revenue by maxing out engagement, and then you have on the other hand side of the coin, let's call it mental health of young people. Like, where is mental health getting figured into their practices? It's totally absent. And they're not like keeping track of what's going on nationwide among adolescents. They're just trying to maximize their ad revenue. So Tristan is a hero in my book for being courageous enough to raise his hand from within the industry and say, guys, some of the stuff we're doing is really, really destructive, and we should really think about it. And the story in The Social Dilemma about how everyone in Google for like a day was like, ooh, Tristan's onto something. We should really like look at this. And then it just sort of dissipated. And then Tristan had to become the person who founds an organization, which I love, the Center for Humane Technology, and become this visionary leader of a movement. It's a movement for humanity. Again, you have on one side of things these massive tech concerns that are enormously profitable and valuable. And then on the other side, you have humanity. Who's fighting for humanity? Again, theoretically, it would be the government. But the government doesn't understand this stuff because they don't understand technology, and the average age of a senator is 62 and the rest of it. Like, they just don't get it. So we are where we are. Thank goodness for Tristan Harris. If you have not seen The Social Dilemma, you should definitely watch it. If anything, it should be required viewing.
So let's just dig into that for a second, because while it's, our audience is geeky and understands this somewhat inside baseball stuff, but the number that comes up when you ask these questions is Section 230. And Section 230 is called by some a license to monetize hate. It is, strangely enough, one of the only things I can think of that both the Democrats and the Republicans, at least in terms of platforms, seem to agree on, which is that they're going to do something about Section 230. Do you have thoughts about what that should be?
I believe that Section 230 was written in 1996. So think about how different the world was then if you're looking at like standards of internet communication. You might have had a GeoCities bulletin board back then. Maybe, Facebook doesn't exist. It's certainly not as fundamental and definitional as it is today. So any common sense American or legislator would look up and say, we need better rules for this stuff. Like right now, you have the Section 230 that has been now broadly applied to let social media companies off the hook for everything under the sun. And Facebook's arguments strike me as so ridiculous, where for a long time they've been like, we're not a publisher, we're a platform. And then you look up and say, wait a minute, you're literally the biggest publisher that has ever existed, like by any standard. They've just been trying to put themselves in this conceptual bucket so they can abdicate any responsibility. And maybe you could have gone away with that when you're a scrappy startup, but you're now worth $650 billion. You were selling and reselling our data for tens of billions of dollars a year. We're not seeing a dime of it. So then pretending you have no responsibility for any of this stuff is garbage. It's really painful. It's painful to see just the total absence of responsibility that some of these concerns are taking. But government has not done us any favors, because we've been relying upon an archaic set of rules that could never have conceived of the world as it exists right now in 2020. And that's what we need to change. I want to help change it. Again, it's one reason I ran for president. We need our government to get its act together on things that the people who are watching this all can see and understand.
So we'll spend just a minute on politics. A couple of big issues that you've had strong feelings about. We'll start with the one that's on everyone's mind, and let's talk about the Supreme Court. I'm frustrated because I think that, there's this temptation for the media to say, well, she's a conservative justice. And, conservative doesn't seem like a bad thing. But if you think about it from a women's rights perspective, the changes that are on the horizon for the Supreme Court are going to change the world for our sons and daughters. I was going to say daughters, but of course the answer is sons and daughters for significantly more than a generation. Is there anything that you imagine that stops this ball from rolling down the court, or is it really just a done deal?
It looks to me like she's going to be confirmed before the election. And I'm with the millions of Americans who do not think that this is appropriate this close to an election. And my only source of optimism, Stephen, is that this may give rise to a drive to modernize the Supreme Court, which has been overdue for years yet again. Why do we still have lifetime appointments? It does not make any sense. Life expectancy is much, much longer now than it was in the days of the founders. And people used to retire from the Supreme Court for non-health reasons. They would just retire to stop. Why do we feel like we have to have 9 justices? There's nothing in the Supreme Court about the number of justices. It was a law written by Congress in 1869. So if we want to modernize that, we can do so through a simple majority vote. So to me, that's the great hope. I believe that Judge Barrett will be confirmed. My great source of optimism is that we don't stop there. We look up and say we should have 18-year term limits, new justices appointed every 2 years, and a maximum number of Supreme Court justices greater than 9.
Well, that's been fascinating. Thank you. Next, we're going to bring in my colleague, Erica Matsumoto. So we went out to our audience and we said, ask us questions that we can pose to Andrew. We got a whole lot of questions, some from our team, some from us, some from people out in the audience. And so, Erica, jump on in here and let's ask Andrew some of the audience questions.
Well, first of all, Andrew, thank you so much for your time today. Your story really resonates with so many people, not just within the Asian American community, but beyond. So yes, we've received a bunch of questions from our NYC Media Lab community, and some of these are going to touch upon new topics, but further upon some of the topics we talked about during the fireside chat. So to begin, you're a technologist and a politician, which some say is a combination of skills we need more of in all levels of government. We talked about Google's AI. What do you envision as the relationship between policy and innovation, especially when it comes to, cutting edge machine learning tools, and keeping in mind how Silicon Valley is often seen as sort of out of touch with the rest of America?
Ideally, Erica, our government would actually be working hand in hand with Silicon Valley leaders in AI research and guidelines. And you're not going to believe this. This is going to be a shocker to a lot of people. But some of the biggest leaders in AI in Silicon Valley have actually said we could use some more regulation because they think that the current dynamic.
Sorry. Sorry, Steve. Can you do the introduction for Erica again? Because even though it was muted, the shot was not ready.
Yep, we'll start from the top.
All right.
And I'm hearing your mic. Okay, you ready? Erica, you ready?
Oh, I'm ready. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, here we go. So Andrew, thank you. That was an extraordinarily interesting conversation. Next, I want to bring in my colleague, Erica Matsumoto. We reached out to our audience and invited them to ask questions. We curated them and chose the best of the best, and Erica is going to bring some of those audience questions to you now. Erica?
Thank you. First of all, Andrew, thank you so much for your time today. Your story really resonates with so many, not only within, but also beyond the Asian American community. So we are really excited to delve into some questions that we received from the New York City Media Lab community. Some of these are new topics in addition to topics that we've talked about during the fireside chat. So to begin, you are a technologist and a politician, which some say is a combination of skills we need more of in all levels of government. You mentioned Google's AI. We've seen OpenAI's recent GPT-3 tool. How do you envision the relationship between policy, regulation, and innovation, especially as it pertains to applications of machine learning and new tech, keeping in mind also that Silicon Valley is often seen as out of touch with the rest of America?
Thank you for the question, Erica. Traditionally, the approach of technologists has been to ignore government or just lobby it enough so that it stays out of their way and does things that you like as an industry. And that approach needs to evolve. I'm happy to say that a number of the most prominent leaders in AI, including Elon Musk, have actually come out and said, look, we actually could use some government guidelines on this because right now the competitive dynamic is going to lead us to go as fast as possible because we're competing with each other and Chinese firms. And then one of us is going to do something very negative or damaging. And we would like to avoid that. So we'd love it if government would give us some rules of the road here. And this was literally Elon Musk saying this to me. So, he's not exactly someone who you think of as like, bring the government in, it's pretty serious if they're into this sort of thing. And so we need to step up and actually give them what they're asking for. And my suggestion to the leaders in AI would be, look, the government will try to be your partner in this. And it won't just be us trying to provide some kind of rules of the road, but we should help support you to the extent that's possible through either access to government databases, which are massive in some dimensions, or things like NOAA and all the weather data, as an example. Like the government has the biggest storehouse of data in some of these areas, but also potentially even helping industry compete in terms of computing infrastructure, because right now Chinese investments in AI are from the public sector and are significantly higher than anything that industry is doing, even our richest companies. I had a Silicon Valley leader sit down with me and say, look, we can invest $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, but we can't invest $20 billion. and that's what we're competing with, because the Chinese government is just writing blank checks and creating matrix style server farm islands as far as the eye can see. I mean, it's very dystopian, but that is the world we're in right now. So the government needs to be providing some breaks and some rules and guidance, but the government can do more than that. The government can actually potentially be a helpful partner and not just someone saying no.
Mm-hmm. Agreed, and that's a really interesting context to view, especially in that global lens. I guess to touch upon that point about data, privacy, and policy, you recently perhaps partnered with the Data Dividend Project, which envisions individuals owning and monetizing their own data. Could you speak a little bit to that? What does that entail? What does that mean?
And I said to Stephen earlier that our data is getting sold and resold right now for over $200 billion a year, and we're not seeing any of it. Where we show up on Facebook and Instagram, there's some strange thing that we agree to in the terms and conditions. We have no idea what it says. We're just like, I agree, and hope for the best. And then you think, well, it's free. But it turns out that we are actually being sold and resold, and our data is to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year. And so the question is, what do we do now? And the most exciting development that's going on in data and privacy rights is Proposition 24, which is on the ballot in California. I believe it will pass. And what it does is it actually elevates the treatment of data and privacy rights in California up to a level that is right now happening in the European Union. So right now you have EU with a very high standard, most of the country with no standard, or like nothing really serious. And then California is now stepping up, and Californian voters, really, this was not born of anyone. Tech companies don't like it, but they're just like, I don't know if we're going to fight this one in time, because it's hard to fight something that's so clearly pro-consumer. So if this thing passes in November, then I believe it will sweep the country. And if you're based in New York, which I think most of you are, you have to ask yourself, why the heck do Californians have better data rights than you do? And the answer there is that your state legislators have not actually bestowed these rights upon you. So the hope is that we can actually have a movement sweep the country, starting in California in November, but then all over the US. And the Data Dividend Project is a step towards activating consumers in this direction, where if you join the Data Dividend Project, and the website's ddpforall.com, you're just saying, I want data rights to be the law, and I will keep track of legislative action, but also if there are class actions or ways that we can get paid for our data, then we can do so right now, because people, frankly, a lot of this stuff is abstract and confusing to most people. They're just like, oh, I hope nothing too bad is happening to my data. So the hope is that we can actually get you excited. So here's one exciting development, for example. Facebook is paying a $650 million settlement to its users in Illinois right now, up to $400 a user, because they misused people's facial scans without telling you. And so if you have a friend in Illinois and they go to ddpforall.com, they can get $400 in number of weeks. $400 is real money, especially if you're young. So that there are ways that we can actually get compensated for our data right now. I'm very passionate about trying to create energy around this, because the tech companies are obviously better served by us. Again, you have the handling of our data on one side, tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and then you have humanity, and so it's up to us to stand up for our own humanity, our own data rights. It's starting in California, but I'd love for it to come to New York too. And if you want to help, ddpforall.com, Data Dividend Project. We're trying to build a movement around it.
Awesome.
All right, here's
Thank
a question. Here's a question from one of our attendees. Mario Vasulo wrote, what does your information look like, Andrew? Your information diet, Andrew, what does it look like? What do you wish existed to help people be more mindful of how they invest their attention?
It's a great question, Mario. So I would not recommend my habits to most people, because I am very active on social media. I ran for president and started with something like 5,000 Twitter followers, and now I'm at 1.6 million. So I do a lot of Twitter. I do social media in different dimensions. And I see that as just part of my role as a public figure now, just trying to put ideas out there that will help move us forward. But I try to be mindful. I try and get outdoor time every day. I try and exercise regularly. I try and turn screens off. I try and just enjoy time with my kids. And I think that likening your information diet to your food intake is actually really useful, where no one should just eat junk food all the time. So what's the information equivalent of junk food? Probably social media, honestly. So if you're getting a lot of social media, you might want to get a hearty meal, which might be a book. You go get yourself a book, and then that can be nutrition. So we should be more mindful about the way we spend our time, because the fact is, if you spend time on your screen on social media, and I do it, so I know, you can while away hours like that. You can be like, oh my gosh, I was just checking my feed and it's like 2 hours later, what the heck happened? So tools that help you actually set limits would be very helpful. But we are outgunned. That's one of the frustrations I have too, because we've gotten so far as a country now, or a society, where we're just like, leave it to the person or leave it to the parent, and that stuff is not actually going to truly balance the scales. It's like we need help. It's a little bit like that, using the diet analogy. It's like, imagine if I said, hey, eat healthy, but I'm just going to surround you with unlimited buffets of junk food all the time. Like your favorite junk food will be surrounding you at all times. Like, how many of us are really going to maintain a healthy diet in that situation? That's pretty much what we're doing to people right now.
So, Erica, we have time for one more question.
All right. Well, we've gotten so many that it's going to be really difficult to choose this last one. But Andrew, I'm going to have to ask you, and you've mentioned, you talked about the courage it takes to be an entrepreneur, and often those risks that come with that. So I'm taking a little bit of a risk to ask you this. But I mean this with the intention to have a really honest conversation about identity. So I personally believe representation really matters, especially in the public and political arena. So I was so excited to see you on stage and running for president. So I have to ask, about the op-ed that you published in the Washington Post, where you asked Asian Americans to, quote unquote, prove their Americanness and assimilate. this seems to have struck a chord amongst not only Asian Americans, but immigrants and people of color broadly. How would you like to respond to some of that criticism that perhaps, we are a diverse, multicultural America? Like, how do we navigate that? And I think this is, there's no perfect answer, but I would just love to hear your thoughts, and ask if your sort of if your thoughts have shifted since.
Well, thanks for the question, Erica. I'm very proud to be the first Asian American man to run for president as a Democrat. And in that op-ed, what I said was just for people to do more. And the actions I asked people to do were to vote, to volunteer, to donate, to make themselves present in their community. I would certainly not use the word assimilate to describe those actions. And certainly that word never appeared in the op-ed. And so if you take those actions in a negative light, then it's just a very different interpretation, because the reality is that Asian Americans are an integral part of the fabric of this country, but we do vote at lower levels than other groups. We do get politically engaged or run for office at lower levels than other groups. And as an Asian American myself, I get that, because certainly growing up, I was not told that American politics was something that I should be trying to invest my time or livelihood in. Like, that was not the message I was getting. And I have a feeling that many Asian Americans around the country were also not getting those messages. So to me, we're as American as anyone else, 100%. But we should be voting at higher levels. We should be volunteering and doing more for a country that has given us a great deal and needs us now more than ever. Like, if Asian Americans actually do get politically activated this time, which I fervently believe is the case, I believe that we could determine the course of this election. And that is what I would love to see happen for us in the entire country.
I'm totally with you there. As we saw in Virginia, and the impact of the Asian American vote, totally with you. So excited.
Andrew, on behalf of the tech community and the folks at the NYC Media Lab and all New Yorkers and attendees here at our Media Summit, thank you so much for taking the time. Incredibly interesting conversation, and look forward to seeing what I think is probably an interesting next chapter in your career.